Hey everybody, welcome back to my Horror Trans podcast. It is Monday. Videos are on schedule this week. Last week was kind of a mess, so I apologize for that. They changed my work schedule. So normally I was off Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and those were the days I did my videos on Saturday for the weekend and published them on Sunday. And then I did my weekday videos on Tuesday and uploaded them on Wednesday. But that didn't work last week because I had to work Wednesday. And now that I know my schedule is changed, I know what it is. So my video schedule won't change. I'm going back to the normal. So what I'm going to do is record the videos on Tuesday and I will upload them on Wednesday after I get home from work. Now, theoretically, I could take my laptop to work and upload them while I'm at work, but I don't want to risk something happening to my laptop, so I won't do that. So, all right, so I wanted to start off each podcast with a what I watched recently segment and then news and rumors before I get into the topics. I'm going to try to keep it between an hour to an hour and a half. I want 90 minutes to be the cutoff, but I want to try to keep it under an hour if I can, or right at an hour if I can. So I have 4 topics this week, but I don't know how far I'm going to get with them, which is why I'm doing the news and rumors section up front. I haven't watched any horror movies in a while. The last one I watched was a Patreon special I did with my friend Gavi. It was Slave Girls from Beyond Infinity. Ugh, I know, but it's a fun commentary. Go listen to it. It's only $1 a month, people. Come on, what's a buck? Anyways, I started 2 horror movies that I didn't finish. I started It's a Wonderful Knife, and I just couldn't finish it. So maybe I'll go back and try to finish it so I can do a proper review. But as of right now, that might not happen because my opinion of that movie is pretty low. Just going to go ahead and give you a fair warning. It's not my kind of comedy. It's not my kind of cheesy horror. I do like cheesy horror, but this isn't the kind of cheesy horror I like. This feels like a Hallmark horror movie, Hallmark Channel horror movie, and I am not a fan of that. But I'm going to give it a fair try. The second one that I started was Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. And the only reason why I didn't finish it was because I fell asleep. So I'm going to go back and finish it probably today, maybe. Hopefully. And that'll be probably my Wednesday review, maybe, if things go well. Now, news and rumors. There's not a lot going on right now in the horror community that interests me. There's still nothing definitive on what's going on with the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. That's still up in the air, and that's a bummer. And the only tidbit of rumor I have, or kind of news, it's not really a rumor. It is news, sort of, and it is that Spyglass has approached Neve Campbell to return for Scream 7, and she's in negotiations. She says under the right conditions, she will return. But I don't know what those conditions are. So, I'm a fan of the Scream franchise, so if they can pull their shit together and come out with a good movie, I'll still probably watch it, but I'll probably pirate it because of the bullshit. But anyways, you didn't hear me say that because I didn't. Because I don't. No, I'll probably watch it, just because it's a Scream movie, and I've seen them all. But I definitely won't be going to the theater to see it. I'll say that. I'll be getting it on free-to-me avenues. Most likely streaming of some sort. But we'll see. We'll see when the time comes. If they can pull their shit together. They might not. The movie might actually end up getting canceled. So, the first topic, let's just jump right in. The Strange World of Tim Burton. Now, Tim Burton movies are not by and large pure, raw horror movies. But they do tend to have a horror aesthetic and creepy imagery. Some of his movies straddle a line between comedy and horror, and some of them are closer to horror than others. Beetlejuice is an example of a comedy that could be considered horror. I don't care what anyone says. Pee-wee's Big Adventure is a horror movie because that clown scene is scary as motherfuck. Oh my god, that is the scariest clown in all of cinema. Oh, that movie gives me a panic attack every time I watch it. So don't tell me that ain't a horror movie, because it is. Okay, putting that aside, he has one that is almost unmistakably horror, and that is his interpretation of the Headless Horseman from the movie, I forgot its name, that's why I called it the Headless Horseman. Sleepy Hollow, there it is. Which is a classic in American literature. Probably one of the first American horror novels. Maybe not. I'm just saying probably one of. I'm not saying the first. I'm saying probably one of. Because I don't know when Edgar Allan Poe was doing his thing. Did Edgar Allan Poe do the Sleepy Hollow? I don't think so. I don't know my literature that well. I didn't, I mean, I passed that class in college, but I didn't pay attention. I was too focused on other things. So. But that being said, he also has Edward Scissorhands, which is a rubbish of a film, and I will not be talking about on any of my channels because I hate it with a fiery passion. But it does have horror elements and imagery. It's kind of like a Frankenstein's monster type situation, in a roundabout way. I don't know. I watched it once when I was like 7 years old, and I thought, ew, this movie's stupid. So, I don't know. There's a chance I rewatch it as an adult and reevaluate it. And then he has a couple others. He has a couple of, I'm going to say animated, but they're stop motion animated films that are decidedly horror, but they're kid-friendly horror. And that is Coraline and The Nightmare Before Christmas, or A Nightmare Before Christmas. I forget which, whatever that word is. Not adjective. I can't remember the term. Whichever word it is, the or a, I can't remember. I've seen it a few times. The rest of his movies fall under the camp of weird as fuck. Not necessarily horror per se, but horrific in their own way. If that makes sense. I can't go all the way out and say I'm not a fan of Tim Burton, because I do enjoy some of his movies, and the movies I enjoy really well. As much as it terrifies me, I do like Pee-wee's Big Adventure. It's just that scary clown scene is really scary. And I love Beetlejuice and Batman. Batman Returns, the one with Catwoman and that weird-ass monster calling itself the Penguin. That is not my Penguin, but whatever. That's a horror movie. I don't care what anyone says. I do enjoy Sleepy Hollow to a point, so I will probably review that one of these days. And I have mixed feelings on A Nightmare Before Christmas. And I'm going to be honest, I never saw Coraline, so I can't talk about it. I've seen his other movies, like Big Fish and Edward Scissorhands and Willy Wonka, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or whatever. Which is where I lean towards. I tend to not be a fan of Tim Burton stuff because his style is too weird for me. And I like weird. It's just he's too weird. There's weird, and then there's really weird, and then there's Tim Burton weird. Tim Burton weird is in a league of his own. So, I definitely can't say Tim Burton is a proper horror filmmaker, necessarily. But he does know how to put horror imagery and elements into his movies regardless of genre. So, even his kids' movies can be terrifying. Whether that's intentional or not, I'll leave up to you. Tim Burton is not on my list of horror icons to do because I don't consider him a horror filmmaker. So, I just don't. I feel like he's a filmmaker that, you know, maybe has some affinity for horror, perhaps. I don't know. But I don't think he's trying to make horror movies, necessarily. Or if he is, he's failing at that. So, I'll say that much. Usually, like a handful of filmmakers I won't name here, usually, if I see his name attached to a project, I immediately erase that project from my memory and dismiss it as, well, that's not something I'm interested in. So, yeah. I'm not a fan of Tim Burton, but I don't hate him like some filmmakers, you know. Like, Fuckface. And if you want to know who Fuckface is, give me $1 on Patreon and I'll do a whole video about him. Alright, moving on. I have 2 franchises that I'm talking about this week. One is a film franchise, and one is a TV show. So let's talk about the TV show first. This is Nickelodeon's Are You Afraid of the Dark? This is another entry-level, kid-friendly horror TV series about a bunch of kids who sit around the campfire telling ghost stories. And some of the ghost stories are scarier than others, but they are legit horror, in my opinion. And when I was a kid, when the show first aired, they were some pretty scary stories. I'm not gonna lie. I think the one with the piano is, to this day, the scariest thing I've ever seen in horror. Sidebar, I don't remember if that was Are You Afraid of the Dark or Goosebumps. So now I have to backtrack. But whichever show that was, the episode with the piano is the scariest thing I've ever seen in all of horror. I don't know why. Obviously, it's been, at this point, 3 decades since I've seen Are You Afraid of the Dark. So my memories are fuzzy. But Are You Afraid of the Dark is a good entry level. It's a good, if you have kids and you want to introduce them into horror, you know, you want to ease them into it, Are You Afraid of the Dark is a good way to do it. Now, if you're like me, the best way to do it is have them watch the show while you turn the lights off and hide behind the couch and make noises. Scratches and, you know, throw balls across the room and do the, you know, wait for the jump scare and then, boo! Jump at them. Because, you know, kids need to be scared. I don't have kids. I think Are You Afraid of the Dark has really good stories, from what I do remember. And I know it's child actors, but I think they all do their part. And I think it's a well-produced TV show. So you got to give Nickelodeon and whoever else was responsible for that credit for actually pulling together a pretty good, decent children's horror television show. Now, it is more or less an anthology type thing, because it's kind of like Tales from the Crypt or Twilight Zone, where each episode is its own story set in its own universe with its own rules. So they're pretty cool. So the way the show works is they sit around a campfire, eating marshmallows, listening to or playing music on the guitar, singing sing-along songs, arguing over who's French kissing who in the woods, etc., etc., etc. And then they sit down and they tell the little this is the tale of the whatever, and they throw the sand on the fire and it goes kaboom, and then the title card, and then you go into the story. Typically, from what I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I remember, is typically one of the camp counselors finds the subject matter of the story personally terrifying, and there's always an after story scene around the campfire where one counselor was like, that was really scary, or they have to calm them down or whatever because it was too scary for them. But I don't know if that's a real memory or if that's something I'm making up in my mind, so correct me if I'm wrong. But it was a pretty good show. I really liked Are You Afraid of the Dark when I was a kid. I wouldn't watch it now. I'm an adult. I don't think it would hold my attention now. The next franchise I want to talk about is a film franchise that I know people are going to be screaming at the monitor, that's not horror, or those aren't vampires. It's Twilight. Now, Twilight is absolutely horror. 100%. And if you don't see that, I don't know what to tell you. It is horror. It's a love story. It's romance horror. But a lot of gothic horror was romantic. So why can't we have modern romantic horror? I don't know. I guess whatever. People are weird. I love the Twilight Saga. And yes, I am reviewing them for Horror Trans because to me they're horror movies. And I don't mean because they're awful movies and they're horrifying to watch. They're legit good movies that have legit good horror elements in them. They're vampires and werewolves and demons and monsters and gore and blood and violence. They're horror. They're not intended to be scary necessarily, but they have scary elements. So, Twilight is kind of a response by Hollywood to Joss Whedon's Buffy the Vampire Slayer television series, which I've previously talked about, in where you have a human who has a romantic interest with an undead vampire. And there also happens to be a war, or not necessarily a war, but a rivalry between the vampires and the werewolves. And the main character, Bella, is torn between two lovers. One, the vampire, and the other one, a werewolf. And this culminates in a clash between the good vampires and the bad vampires, which is pretty cool. Those are some really awesome bloody horror scenes, by the way. And these movies are bloody. They really are. So I definitely consider them horror. I don't think I would say the Twilight movies are necessarily scary, but horror doesn't have to be scary to be horror. But they are definitely horror. I tend to side with Bella pairing up with the vampire. I think his name was Edward, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember names very well, so forgive me. So yeah, I would say I'm Team Edward, I guess, is the thing. If I'm getting that correct, Twilight fans, if there are any watching this video, will correct me. Because I assume there are horror fans who are also Twilight fans. Don't tell me there aren't, because I know there are. There has to be. As far as the mythos, the vampire legend in Twilight is pretty cliche, I'll admit, but there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, cliche works for a reason, it's classic. I use the word classic over cliche, you know? And I like it. I enjoy it. However, I'm not going to get into the logical inconsistencies because there are, and the possible creepy hints at pedophilia because it's there. Grown ass man psychically linking himself to an infant that he has to now protect and then eventually marry. That's a little creepy. But, problematic bullshit aside, I think the Twilight films are fine movies. I have to take this. Sorry for the interruption. That was my lawyer calling, and I have to take that call. Alright, so let's recap. Twilight is horror, but it's not probably the greatest horror, but it's romantic, and that's good. There's nothing wrong with romantic horror. We're 22 minutes into the show, just about, and I'm already up to my final topic of the episode. Oh dear. And I know this one isn't going to give me very much, so I'm gonna go ahead and hit pause real quick and put a couple more topics on the docket. Well, if I can hit the pause. All right, I'm back, and you didn't even know I was gone. Okay, you did because I told you. So the last topic was going to be elevated horror. I don't know how far this one's going to get me, but I'm going to go ahead and try. Elevated horror is a concept that has come up recently that is a rehash of a previous concept that we've had in society as a way for people who are not horror fans to enjoy some horror movies. Previously, it was thrillers. If somebody liked a horror movie, but they didn't want to admit that they liked a horror movie, they just dismissed and said, "Oh, it's not a horror movie; it's a thriller." Because there's this sort of stigma around horror. People think you have to be a creep or a weirdo or a freak to like horror. I mean, we are, but you don't have to be. I wouldn't say creep or weirdo. Well, we are weirdos. Freak? I don't know. Anyways, elevated horror is an extension of that, an evolution of that concept. It is a way for films to be made that appeal to horror fans, but also appeal to non-horror fans. These are movies that tend to be more artsy and artistic and focused. A lot of cinematography, a lot of, backstory and imagery and things like that, rather than just, kills and scares. And sometimes you have to really think about, are they even horror or not? A couple of examples that I have seen that I can talk about. I've already reviewed and talked about Midsummer. Midsummer is a lot of people's go-to example of elevated horror. I'm using air quotes here. And as my first impression of the concept, and it wasn't a film I enjoyed at all, my immediate impression was, I don't know if I'm going to like elevated horror. Midsummer is, don't get me wrong, a beautiful movie, and very subtle in its horror. And to me, I feel like it's too subtle. There was the potential for some really graphic, really violent, really gory scenes in that movie that we didn't get to see. It was all done off camera. And that's disappointing to me because I'm here for the kills. I want the blood. If you're not going to give me blood, give me boobs. And it didn't have either. So I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on here? So, I wasn't a fan of Midsummer. Now, another movie that is tossed out there as elevated horror that I also didn't enjoy, and I've already reviewed it, is The Babadook. This is another one that I think is a pile of rubbish and is way fucking overrated. Now, this one is more obvious horror than Midsummer, so I would definitely put this one firmly in the horror camp, whereas Midsummer, I'm kind of like, I don't even know if I call it horror, to be honest, but it is what it is. I definitely don't call it a thriller because it's not. But I don't use the word thriller as shorthand for horror movie that isn't a horror movie. It's a specific term for me, but I'll get to that when I get to it. I didn't hate The Babadook. I just didn't enjoy it. I thought it was a well-made film, but it just wasn't for me. Same with Midsummer. I thought, no, I'll take that back. The Babadook was a well-made film I didn't enjoy. Midsummer is a pile of fucking shit. Dog shit. It's not well made at all. Beautiful, yes. But that's it. The cinematography is the only thing that movie has going for it. As far as I'm concerned. The story is bullshit. The characters are bullshit. The plot isn't even there. The kills are bullshit. The ending is bullshit. That movie's just dog shit all the way around. It's an insult to dog shit. So I will not consider Midsummer a true horror movie. I reviewed it because people wanted me to. Probably expecting me to love it because people love it for some ungodly reason I can't fathom. But it is what it is. The third example I have of what they call elevated horror that I have seen is It Follows. Now, I gave it a Rent review when I reviewed it, but I didn't hate It Follows like I did Midsummer, and it wasn't as boring as The Babadook. And again, It Follows is more obvious horror, as far as I'm concerned. I had a couple of issues with It Follows. My first issue was the movie wasn't consistent in its timeline. It kind of wanted you to think it took place in the 70s or 80s, but it also kind of wanted you to think that it took place today or maybe in the near future. And it also kind of wanted you to think that it had a plot when it didn't. It had better kills than the off-screen bullshit we got in Midsummer and the non-existent kills in The Babadook, which is one of my issues with it. Not saying you have to have kills for it to be a horror movie, but come on. If you're going to try to convince me it's the scariest thing you've ever seen, somebody better fucking die. And I don't mean in a flashback 20 years ago or whatever it was. I guess it couldn't have been 20 years ago because the kid wouldn't have been a kid. Anyways, whatever. Now, I don't know if you would classify Stephanie as elevated horror or not. It definitely felt to me like it was trying to be if it wasn't. If it is, that's one I did enjoy. If it isn't, well, I enjoyed it anyways. But I just don't understand the term elevated horror, and I'm still kind of ticked off that was the subject matter of one of the Screams, and I don't remember which one. I think it was Scream 6, but I can't remember. Scream 5? Maybe it was Scream 5. I can't remember. They all kind of bleed together in my mind at this point. That's not to say I'm going to go out on a limb and say I'm not a fan of elevated horror, because there are some who I've been told are classified as such that I still want to see, that I might actually still enjoy. I just don't... I am dismissive of the concept. To me, horror is horror. Whether it's an artsy horror film or a schlocky horror film or a B-movie, I don't care. I think elevated horror is a term they came up with so that we could give horror movies awards that typically go to non-horror movies because horror usually gets the shaft in that regard. A horror movie can get awards for special effects or screenplay, but it can't get Best Picture very often, very easily. Fuck off. However, yeah, I think horror is complicated because it's not all, serial killers and, naked teens getting their heads cut off. I wish it was, but that's just me. Now, let's get into why I love the slasher genre so much. This one I could probably talk about for a while. The slasher subgenre of horror is actually kind of not only well defined enough, but well represented enough that it transcends horror and has sort of become its own genre of film, separate from horror. Even though slashers are horror movies, they're slashers. It's a thing. It's its own thing. And I love them. And two, I think that's pretty fucking cool that horror is so well defined and broad that it has subgenres that are well defined. Because that's pretty fucking cool. Comedies are dude bros, dick and fart jokes, and buddy comedies. Road trip comedy is also a buddy comedy, so it's kind of like, I'm not a fan of comedies. And rom-coms are their own goddamn thing. So for starters, the one thing I like about the slasher film is they tend to have better pacing than some horror films. By and large, there are outliers, but they tend to be slower paced with jump scares and the kills and the thrills spaced out enough to keep you going the whole movie. Sometimes you get like a kill up front and then they space it out and give you a little bit of story. Sometimes you get some unnecessary exposition, actually a lot. But I mean, you gotta have something of a plot, don't you? I mean, it can't just be horny teens in the woods getting slashed to death. I mean, it could, but for some people it can't, I guess. So there are some key elements to a slasher film. Generally, they tend to appear similar to mystery films, murder mysteries and things, because you have an unknown killer stalking a group of usually kids, but vulnerable people. Usually teenagers, but sometimes college kids, sometimes adults, sometimes space marines, whatever. The slasher genre is interesting because it's pretty well defined. You have a singular killer by and large, stalking a group of people, killing them one by one. They don't always know who the killer is, or they don't always believe the killer is who it is, or don't believe in the killer at all and think something else is going on. Sometimes, but not often and not necessarily mandatory, they have a twist ending, but that's kind of rare, and it's not a staple of the franchise of the genre. I get those two words mixed up. I apologize. I promise I know words. I studied English in college. It's just early and it's cold and my brain is mush and I haven't had enough caffeine yet. Anyways, they also tend to have a single victim who survives and either defeats the killer or escapes, one way or the other. This is usually a female human character, hence the trope final girl, which is a staple of the slasher franchise, but not always. Sometimes it is a male. Now it can be a gay man or an effeminate man in some cases, but it can be a man. And I know people are going to talk about Predator as a slasher movie, and in that one instance it can be a muscular action hero, I guess. But anyways, Slasher movies also tend to be bloody and gory. Usually, but not always, and not mandatory, they show the kills. Sometimes they show more kills than others, but usually you at least see one kill in a slasher movie, usually. Even if the rest are off camera or in flashbacks. I don't know. And when you do see the kills, hence the name slasher, they tend to be pretty brutal. Pretty gory, pretty bloody, pretty violent, pretty visceral at times. So they tend to be satisfying in that regard. Now, in some cases, the stalker is not known until the end, the final scene or act of the movie, where it is revealed who the killer is. And sometimes they know who the killer is, but like I said, they either don't believe it, or it's like an urban legend or something, and they're just like, they're dismissive of it until they get killed by it. Whatever it is. And sometimes they know it's coming. So they're prepared, or they try to be prepared, but they're not as prepared as they thought they were. Some of the more prominent slasher franchises would be Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Child's Play, Scream, The Sleepaway Camp, Silent Night, Deadly Night, Prom Night, My Bloody Valentine. I hesitate to throw Black Christmas in there, but why not? And another trope of the slasher genre, which we don't always get and isn't mandatory, but it is common enough that it is a trope, is the killer POV shot. You're watching the killer murder people or stalk people through the killer's eyes. Now, slashers also tend to have two additional components that are more common than not. Not necessary, not mandatory, but more common than not. The first element is the morality tale. You tend to have kids who are doing bad things, or bad by society standards. Doing drugs, having sex, cheating on their partner, driving recklessly, partying excessively, drinking alcohol while they're underage, etc. And then the boogeyman picks them off one by one for their sins. Now, this was an unintentional consequence of the killing teenagers, because teenagers just behave badly. They're rebellious. They're exploring life. They want to enjoy. They're trying to figure out what they enjoy and what they don't enjoy. So they're experimental and rebellious by nature. The second component of most slasher movies, but again, not mandatory and not all slasher movies have it, is the nudity. Now, we tend to get way more female nudity, usually full frontal, but sometimes butts, than we do male nudity. If we get male nudity, it's usually butts, but occasionally you get dicks. Very rarely, but you do. The most famous example is the only example of a dick in a movie where I would say the dick shot was necessary to the plot, and that's Sleepaway Camp, which I've already reviewed, I believe, so hopefully you've already seen it. But the dick shot in that movie, I would say, is 110% essential to the plot. That's the only instance where I would say nudity was necessary, in that one instance. The other times, it's just there to be there. And a lot of times, it doesn't even make fucking sense. You have a teenage girl alone in the house, in her bedroom by herself, stripped down to nothing, sit in front of the mirror, and just admire her tits for whatever reason. I was never a teenage girl, so I don't know if they do that or not. But from the women I've talked to, that doesn't seem to be a thing. But I don't know. Maybe it is. I guess if you got nice jugs, it is. maybe? I don't know. And for whatever reason, female characters tend to get naked for no reason at all. They just take their clothes off and walk outside for whatever reason and then get killed. It happens in a lot of slasher movies. Sometimes the nudity is gratuitous and excessive. Especially in the Friday the 13th franchise, which is one of the boobiest franchises in the slasher genre. I would say tits are necessary to make a Friday the 13th movie. You gotta have the boob shot, otherwise it's not a Friday the 13th. As a queer woman who is somewhat feminist, I would like more representation of the male nudity in horror in general, but especially in slashers. Especially ones that have a final man instead of a final girl or boy, I guess, if we're going to be using the same kind of gendering terms. Final woman? We never call her a final woman. You notice that? It's always final girl. So final boy. I'll be fair. The slasher genre tends to be reminiscent of the campfire story. So this tends to be like, they tend to be like kids at a summer camp or out at the woods or, you know, just at the lake for the weekend or whatever, sitting around a campfire telling ghost stories. You know, the man with the hook, or the babysitter that's inside, the stalker that's inside the house calling the babysitter, those kinds of things. You know, cautionary tales, as it were, which is very in your face in the Scream franchise, as well as I Know What You Did Last Summer and Urban Legend, because that's the central focus of the films. The slasher genre tends to be more on the schlocky side. They tend to be B movies. They don't have to be, but they mostly are. And so they do appeal to they do tend to appeal to people that have, I would argue, myself included, I'm putting myself in this camp, lower standards for cinema than movie snobs. But that's okay. Not everything has to be art. I mean, it's all art, but not everything has to be high art. Whatever the fuck that term means. And, I don't know. I just feel like I just love slasher movies, you know? Sometimes I just want to see teenagers get hacked to pieces, you know? And I love a good decapitation. You give me a good decapitation, I'm good. I'm good. Your movie's going to get a good review almost automatically if it has a good decapitation, even if the rest of the movie sucks. I'm looking at you, Urban Legend. I just love the slasher genre. It's one of my favorite, if not my absolute favorite, horror genre. I also like ghost stories and demon stories, but those ones tend to be scarier for me. And I also really love vampires and zombie movies. I don't find vampire movies scary at all. Zombie movies, it depends. Now, the final trope that is common, and I would argue is mandatory or necessary for a slasher, is the jump scare. The pacing of the movie is done in such a way to build tension for the jump scare, leading up to the jump scare. So I would argue slasher movies don't always have the jump scare, and they don't need to over-rely on it. But I think you need at least one jump scare in your slasher movie, you know, to be a proper slasher. You should be using the tension to build the jump scare to break the tension that you've been building up for the last 15-20 minutes or so. If you're making a good slasher, anyways. Now, I know there are some people who despise jump scares, and in a movie that you're not expecting it, yeah, I can be like, hey, whoa, that was out of nowhere. But you should be expecting it in a slasher movie. And you should be looking forward to it in a slasher movie because it's a thing. Slashers also tend to have adult killers punishing adolescent victims. In some cases, the adult is a man-child, like in the case of Friday the 13th or Halloween, where they never really developed mentally into an adult. And sometimes it's a creepo, borderline bad guy. Bad guy. You know what I mean? Like Freddy Krueger. And sometimes it's just a psychopath who escaped from prison or the mental hospital or wherever. The escaped convict is one of the tropes in the, or escaped mental patient is a trope in the slasher genre. More often than not, actually. Especially in the good ones. But also in the not so good ones. Slasher movies also tend to have a musical aesthetic that is very distinct. Usually, they have either like melodic synth music, or they have violins and string instruments, or they have hair metal. Sometimes they have all three. On at least one or two occasions I can think of, Friday the 13th Part 3 and Prom Night, they had disco tunes, which was really out of place for a slasher, I would say. I would say the disco tune in Friday the 13th works better than the disco in Prom Night, but that's because I didn't enjoy Prom Night as much as I wanted to and tried. I'm starting to wonder if I just don't like Jamie Lee Curtis. And I don't like the movies she's in. I don't know. No, I like some movies that Jamie Lee Curtis is in. I don't think I have a problem with her. It's just she happens to be in horror movies I don't enjoy. But I don't think it's because she's in it. Because I have enjoyed some movies some horror movies she was in, so I don't know. The other common trope, besides the final girl, is the Scream Queen, which again can be a male or female. Scream Queen is someone who screams her lungs out, by and large. She screams a lot. She gets scared easy. And the Scream Queen is such a trope that it actually got a whole TV show named after it. So kudos for that. I tend to really enjoy slasher movies. Now, I don't really know how to end these podcasts other than telling you about my other content. So I'll go ahead and do that right now, as that seems to be a thing people do with their podcasts. So you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at StephanieBree22, BRI. And you can also read my blog, StephanieBree.com. It's not as active as it used to be, because I just finished my first novel, which you can find on Amazon. It's called Goldfish on the Mountain. And so I'm taking a break from writing because I got to unpack, because it took me 11 years to finish my novel. Which is a horror novel, by the way, so go check it out. It is not a slasher, actually. It's a crime thriller with horror elements. And I also have 2 more YouTube channels. Stephanie Bree, my main YouTube channel, where I just talk about random shit, whatever's on my mind. And I also do a top 25 on that channel every twice a week, because I do all my videos twice a week, once on the weekend and once during the week, usually on Wednesdays, sometimes on Thursdays or Tuesdays. It just depends on how my schedule falls. And then I have another channel called Breeze Toys, Britoys, Breeze Toys. And so that one is where I just show off toys from my collection. Sometimes it's a horror toy, sometimes it's a Transformer, or a Care Bear, or a doll, or an action figure, or whatever. Just toys from my collection. I have over 500 toys in my collection, counting the Hot Wheels, but not counting the Legos, because those are separate. Because if I counted the Legos, I don't know how to count them. Do you count the pieces or do you count the Lego sets? Because I don't really buy Lego sets necessarily. So yeah, I do that. And then I do this podcast once a week. I try to get the video out on Monday, and then the audio portion comes later. But I'm going to be honest, I might stop doing the audio portion because it's a lot of work, and my work schedule has changed. So I don't know if I have time to go in and extract the audio file and upload it to Anchor anymore. I didn't do it last week because I just didn't have the time. And I think I'm probably going to just stop doing that and just make this a video podcast, I guess. Which I don't know if it even counts as a podcast anymore at that point. But I don't know. I have to balance my time, and it's getting difficult to do because I've got so much going on. Don't look for me on Facebook. I do not add friends on Facebook. Only a handful of people I know in real life. So if I don't know you personally, don't even bother sending me don't even bother looking for me on Facebook. You won't find me because my account is hidden. I'm not even in search results. I think that's everything I wanted to talk about. Oh, and the Patreon. Go to patreon.com/StephanieBree. And you can get content, bonus content. I do 2 bonus contents a month. I do a audio commentary where I watch a horror movie with my friend and we commentate on it. It is not riff tracks or Mystery Science Theater 3000. We're just talking about the movie as we're watching it. Our observations, our thoughts, things like that. Sometimes if we're watching a cheesy B movie, it can be a riff, but it's not what the intended purpose is of that commentary. The other piece of content I put out once a month is a Zoom Q&A. Now, I haven't been doing them because I only have 2 Patreon supporters. One never shows up to the Zoom Q&As anyways. And the other one is my girlfriend, who I talk with every day on Discord, so I don't need to do a private Q&A with her or a public Q&A with her because, that would be weird. Because she gets the private Q&As. So, as of right now, that's the end of the show. Stay cool. See you next week.